Alright guys, the Middle East is still in crisis mode and this disaster is getting worse. It's an emergency video. I know, the US coalition, they have a naval armada there, but it isn't effective. The Red Sea is still on fire and now we have a new report that Iran, they have made a big move. If things escalate further, we'll have a new inflation crisis on our hands. The economy is already in horrible shape, but this will be the mother lode. In our lead story today, Iran captures oil tanker off Oman as Middle East turmoil deepens. Iran, they just poured oil onto the fire. The seizure was apparently in retaliation for the oil theft conducted by the US. Back in September, the US seized the Suez Rajan and its cargo of 1 million barrels of crude. There was an Iranian cargo being sold to the Chinese. The US took the oil away and now Iran, they have taken revenge. Iran just did a grand theft auto on a US controlled ship. It's a vessel called the St. Nicholas, which was the same Suez Rajan a year back, just sailing under a new name now. 5 men, they went on board and basically took over the tanker. It's a hijacking in the Arabian Sea. The capture happened in the Gulf of Oman. That's near the Strait of Hormuz, the vital choke point for energy trade. This means the Iranians can in fact target ships heading into and out of the Persian Gulf. Any shipment of oil and gas out to the world is now at risk. We have absolutely no idea what Iran might be planning next. Now, this comes just a day after the Houthis fired drones in the Red Sea, and that was after the warning from Anthony Blinken. So it's escalation after escalation throughout the entire Middle East. The Suez Canal is compromised, and that's 12% of global trade affected. A ton of vessels have to go around Africa now. Then we have the famous Strait of Hormuz. Around 20 million barrels of oil flow through this strait. That's 20% of global oil consumption. If this gets blocked, it will be simply unthinkable. You think 8 or 9% CPI is bad? It's time to prepare for double-digit inflation in the worst-case scenario. Now that Iran is involved, this adds a bigger precedence for the US to take action. Recall the threat made by Lindsey Graham to Iran back in October. If you escalate the war, we are coming for you. Let's not forget Mitch McConnell labeling Iran as part of the axis of evil that is a growing threat to the US and NATO. So there are elements in Washington that seek a direct confrontation as well. Unlike the Russia-Ukraine war, the Middle East is actually a bigger powder keg, especially for the global economy. This is the energy hub of the world, and if it blows up, that's it for everyone. And the insanity just reached new levels. I have breaking news that I need to share. Just this act alone might be the trigger for wider war in the Middle East. The United States and the UK, they have taken action. They have launched airstrikes on Yemen to hit the Houthis. Even though this would most definitely escalate things, they went on ahead. Heavy explosions were reported in Yemen's capital and their port city, so vital targets are being hit to send the Houthis scrambling. This is literally the biggest gamble the West has taken so far. It's the ultimate diplomatic risk and it could trigger a bigger war in the region. The Middle East is becoming a battleground. Let's talk about the diplomatic disaster this would cause. Firstly, there's already no ceasefire coming, so the Gaza war isn't ending anytime soon. Then you have Qatar and Saudi Arabia warning the US not to escalate things further, but America went on ahead. If you're the Middle East, how would you view this? Does it look like the US or the UK took your warning seriously? It's getting harder and harder for them to really view the West as peacemakers now. It isn't a surprise why the Middle East is moving closer and closer towards the global south, especially towards BRICS. It doesn't take a genius to see why this is happening. Now that Yemen has been attacked and Iran has been taking action near the Persian Gulf, nothing's off the table. The entire axis of resistance could erupt at any moment. A big country at risk is none other than Saudi Arabia. They are sandwiched between a bunch of Iranian proxies. There's a peace deal happening between Riyadh and the Houthis now, but this strike threatens to derail things. If the oil fields get targeted or becomes collateral damage, we'll have a bigger energy crisis on our hands. Now, this might seem like a victory for the West, a successful counterstrike on the Houthis, but we all should be worried. The Middle East is really a complex region. You can't solve every issue by blowing things up. Iran, they've been laying low, but with the Yemen attack, who knows what might happen next? According to a former US official in Yemen, the strikes are seen as a failure of US diplomacy, and he has a very dire premonition of what's to come. I think this is a bad mistake. There should have been a better effort to deter the Houthis. If the US and Britain thinks that this will silence the Houthis, I think they have got another thing coming. By striking Yemen, he believes that the US is now a direct participant in the Gaza war. And if that's true, this is terrible for the world. We might be in for an endless cycle of retaliation. The Houthis might very well retaliate against the US coalition. They could be targeting US warships next, then all bets are off. The US has shown that they will strike back, and I don't see the Houthis backing down either. And it's important that we analyze President Biden's statement about the Yemen strikes. It tells us that there's no reverse gear left. According to the White House, the strikes were done by the US military with the UK, backed by Australia, Bahrain, Canada, and the Netherlands. And here's the key part: I will not hesitate to direct further measures to protect our people and the free flow of international commerce as necessary. This brings up a very critical question. Now that Iran has seized a vessel near the Persian Gulf, does this mean the US will take action there as well? We are now at an unprecedented level of escalation. What's crazy is how vessels transiting the Red Sea are advertising their links to China to avoid the Houthi attacks. I'm not joking here. At least 5 vessels are using their signals to broadcast information like an all Chinese crew or the ship being a vessel from China. Instead of putting their destination, they are advertising their connection to Beijing. It's one step further than signaling they have no links to Israel. And that's how desperate the entire situation is on the Red Sea. Shipping giants are also spooked out. The container giant Maersk is warning that the chaos may last for months. Only the brave would dare to traverse the Red Sea route. You'll be caught in a firefight between the Houthis and the Naval Alliance. And this is going to jack up shipping rates and insurance as well, right? Any increase in costs will eventually trickle down to you and me, the end consumers. India, for example, is starting to get hit financially. The impact of the Red Sea crisis is hammering away at their economy. From Bloomberg, India's exports may take a $30 billion hit on Red Sea threats. It's so bad that traders are holding back a quarter of their export shipments. It's not just the higher cost, they don't want any damage or worse, their entire ship sinking underwater. And this fear could translate to a 6.7% drop in India's exports to the world. This will impact their GDP numbers and slow the economy down. Now, project this across the entire world. An increase in costs worldwide. You add Japan, you add China, Europe, and the US into the mix. You have a recipe for collapse in global trade. It truly doesn't matter where you're shipping from. Whether from Asia to America or Europe, rates across the board they have flown up. They are easily double or triple what they were a few months back. Shanghai to Rotterdam, LA or Genoa, everything is up. And if the Houthis retaliate, which they likely will, costs are going to skyrocket even further. If you're an exporter, you have a tough choice to make. Either you jack prices higher, which could lose you customers, which is a very real risk today. Remember, we are going to a global recession, or restrict your exports and play the waiting game. That reduces the supply of goods to the world, that in turn also keeps prices high. Either way, it's a lose-lose proposition. And this smells like another inflation crisis is coming, which ties in perfectly with the next economic disaster we have to talk about. And that, of course, is the latest US inflation report. We all know the CPI numbers, they are full of hedonic adjustments, right? They don't reflect what's really happening on the ground. But even those are spelling doom and gloom. US inflation picks up, signaling bumpy path for the Federal Reserve. The CPI has rebounded back to 3.4%, the most in the last quarter. Remember what Janet Yellen said a week ago? She declared that a soft landing is coming for the US economy. But that's a premature victory lap. She's trapped in twilight zone economics. Inflation is still a clear and present danger. If we throw in the recent escalations, January's figures might be even worse. Looking at the US CPI, we can see inflation is still very sticky. Headline CPI has rebounded from 3.1% in November to 3.4% last month. In other words, prices have gone up on average. Core inflation, excluding food and energy, is also a disaster. It came in at 3.9%, hardly moving since October. Everything from services to housing costs is still crazy high. Across services, inflation is still a big crisis. Motor insurance is up by 20.3%, rent is up by 6.5%, healthcare is up by at least 6.7% as well. A lot of these items aren't discretionary spending, it's the bare essentials. This, of course, is going to complicate the Federal Reserve's inflation fight. Remember what everyone is predicting today, that the Federal Reserve will be cutting interest rates in March. Powell will be cutting 3 times and will be back down to 4.75% by the year's end. Right now, the market is pricing in a massive pivot going to Q1 this year. Treasury yields are starting to fall with the 10-year heading below 4%. People believe the Fed will cut because the inflation fight is over and it's a big pivot back to economic growth. But what if the cuts don't come on time in March? If the Red Sea explodes further and Iran gets dragged into the mess, we could see a massive spike in energy inflation. So here's the situation. This chaos could be enough to delay the rate cuts to Q2 or even Q3, and that would destroy the crazy valuations of the stock market today. The S&P 500 is near all-time highs even though company earnings they are uncertain. So the market is priced for perfection, they're priced for 100%. Investors believe there's no hard landing, there's no soft landing coming. We are going straight to the moon. According to Master from the Federal Reserve, March is too early for a rate cut. The December CPI report just shows there's more work to do and that work is going to take restrictive monetary policy. In other words, inflation is still a big disaster and the Fed wants to keep rates higher for longer. The schedule for rate cuts might be pushed back into Q2 at the very earliest. If January CPI comes in hotter because of the Red Sea crisis, then it is a big U-turn for the recent market rally. And this is how critical the Middle East really is. It's not just a hub for energy production, it is at the center of global trade. And once that breaks down, we'll get hit by supply-side inflation from all sides. At the same time, you still have the US government spending money like no tomorrow. Congress just agreed on a $1.6 trillion spending level for 2024. So demand-side inflation isn't coming down either. There's still a fiscal spending crisis on Capitol Hill going on. We have to watch the entire Middle East situation carefully. In the short term, it could trigger a global recession if things explode. In the long term, this would just change the world order as we know it. Just ask yourself a simple question. After the strikes on Syria, Iraq, and now Yemen, plus there's no ceasefire coming, are the Arab countries happy or are they angry with the United States? It's a very basic question, but it kind of sums up the entire diplomatic disaster. It's not rocket science to figure out where the winds will blow. Even a blind monkey can tell what's coming down the road. We can see this immediately from Saudi Arabia's statement after the Yemen strike. The kingdom is calling for restraint and avoiding escalations. The strikes from the US and Britain obviously spooked them out, and this feeds into the chaos machine and threatens to destabilize everything further. Just before the strikes, the Houthis gave the world a chilling warning. According to their leader, any US attack on Yemen's Houthis will not go without response, and he's of course referring to further military escalations. The response will be greater than the attack that was carried out with 20 drones and a number of missiles, and this means a deadly feedback loop has now been triggered. The US escalates, the Houthis will then strike back, and that in turn causes the coalition to strike even harder, which prompts even more attacks. It's aggression versus aggression, and who really knows how things will end? So let's watch this carefully. If things get out of hand, we'll be back in an inflation crisis and most likely a global economic collapse. But let me know what you think. Will the conflict turn into a regional war? Is a new inflation crisis coming again? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.